Well, thank you for coming. I'm super excited to chat with you. I think you know that Asher and I actually have been doing this sort of like Ordinal's Bitcoin native assets markets podcast that we like
Oh,
periodically like jump on the internet and do. Yeah, I'm
very
upping my
good.
podcasting game though right now. You'll see I
Yeah.
have like an official background and like lights and a camera and stuff now. So we're moving on up in the world. But like one of the things that I really wanted to address is the sort of technical side of things. I mean, we're seeing this, I call it like the deluge of Bitcoin L2s kind of coming into the market. And I think we talked about yesterday, I think I had said yesterday when we chatted that there are 90 something L2s. I heard there's now over 100 Bitcoin L2s. Definitely, probably more than a quadruple increase since ordinals came onto the scene 2 years ago, which I would consider a catalyst for all of this new technical development and technical
Mm,
investment in Bitcoin. But yeah, so I thought I just like would start the conversation by asking you, why do you think we're seeing all of this new Bitcoin L2 narrative coming about so hard and so fast and so furious over the past couple of years?
yeah, I think that's a great idea, a great question. So, like, just some background for your listeners. I'm coming from Lightning, so I've been working on Lightning since 2018. So maybe we call that like the OG layer two for Bitcoin. I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't know if that's controversial or not. But so I've been working in the L2 space for a long time now. And yeah, all these new protocols coming in is really interesting. I've never seen anything like it before in Bitcoin. But I think when you say like, okay, the ordinal launch really, I think, inspired people to really start rethinking how Bitcoin can be like a base layer for layer twos. The ETH ecosystem around the time that Lightning was taking off or getting started on Bitcoin, I feel like they had a lot of energy around L2. So like there was like I feel like there was like a wave of L2 design on Ethereum. Like one of the guys who started the Lightning Network was actually more involved with like the Ethereum ecosystem, Joseph Poon. He was behind a lot of designs over on Ethereum with like Plasma, I think. I feel like Patrick McCory was like really on Twitter a lot, talking about like all kinds of different state channel designs that they could do on Ethereum. So like, I guess I'm trying to say like there've been layer two like epochs over on ETH. Bitcoin has never had one. Or lots of people are trying to build and design and ship and be like the layer two that has lots of volume, that kind of thing. Maybe that's not entirely fair to like, Rootstock, which has been around a long time, being an EVM, that kind of stuff. So there's always been projects, but I think you're totally right in that we're like this like Cambrian explosion sort of like situation. And I think I would think like if someone you map it out on the timeline, I think you're totally correct that like ordinals, I think more than anything really inspired people that like one, maybe there is demand for building on top of Bitcoin. And two, like that there's like a way you could do it with like the BRC20 kind of stuff, right? But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe someone else would have like a different narrative about where that comes from. But just kind of like, watching it from the Lightning ecosystem, whatever the cause is, there's definitely like lots and lots of new projects. And they're all different like protocols too, right? So like how they work under the hood is all really different. I think it's going to be really interesting to see which layer twos ends up getting enough volume and traction and like really Bitcoin locked into it. Because I think one thing that we don't really talk about a lot in the layer two ecosystem, and I think maybe is worth considering, is there's only 21 million Bitcoin. I guess like technically 18 million, right? Every layer two is proposing that Bitcoin is going to want to be locked into its contracts on the layer one so that then you can use the Bitcoin on the layer two, right? But there's only a limited amount of Bitcoin and Bitcoin hodlers. So at some point, you're sort of like competing with every other layer two to get Bitcoin locked into your contracts or your bridges, etc. So, I think I don't know what the Ethereum situation is. I think Ethereum is a little different with their layer two stuff because they had the ERC20s on the native layer that then could get locked into layer twos, etc. So if maybe Runes is or like the ordinal ecosystem is going to play into like that's what you're locking into these second systems with all these like secondary coins, etc. Or is it like, but if it's actually Bitcoin that you're trying to get locked into your ecosystems, like how many people are you going to have to convince to lock their Bitcoin into your protocol so that you can then have liquidity and trades and that kind of thing? So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I think you kind of touched on there are a few different kind of architectures for Bitcoin layer twos that are coming into development that are sort of ultimately going to end up competing for liquidity, right? I mean, like at some point, not all of these L2s can work. There are going to be, a small number of winners, maybe even just like one or two, even, and a large number of losers. And they're largely competing on architecture right now. Although I think that will change. I think there will be like commercial and marketing competitions as well once these things start to become live and like functional in like greater numbers, those that make it that far.
It'll be really interesting to see who ends up like if there's going to be a winner, right? I don't know. I don't
There
know.
could be a couple and there could be a handful of winners, but I'm curious, like, so, I mean, we sort of also chatted yesterday. There's like a handful of like core architecture types that seem to be competing with one another. And like, it would be interesting even just to kind of maybe outline, like, what are those? Like, what is an L2? And then like, what are like the types of L2s
Mm.
that we're seeing be built on Bitcoin?
Yeah, so this idea about what is a layer two is a question I think people have been asking ever since it kind of became a term of art or like a marketing term that people have been using to like raise VC money on, right? Like the reason you call yourself a layer two is because you want to be able to go out and get like some sort of like, it's a way of marketing or advertising your project. I did a talk at MIT Bitcoin Expo, I want to say 2 years ago, where it was like, okay, let's talk about layer twos and let's go through like my own like definition of what is a layer two. So I tend to focus, I know a lot of these like layer two projects talk about like other assets, like being able to issue like coins, that sort of thing. But I think so coming from Lightning, the thing that we care about on Lightning as layer two builders is like being able to move Bitcoin around, right? So I think of layer twos really from an accounting books standpoint. Layer one is like the base chain layer, and that's where we keep track of who owns what Bitcoin, right? It's an accounting ledger. Like that's basically all Bitcoin was set out to be, is an accounting ledger where you can't double spend money. If I send you money, you're the only person that can get it. Layer two is basically like it's expensive to be transacting at that layer. How do we take like money that existed on layer two, kind of lock it up into a contract or some kind of contract? Maybe that's a multi-sig, maybe that's some fancy new thing that maybe we'll talk about in a bit, but you're going to lock money up on layer one. So you're no longer keeping track of who owns it on layer one. It's kind of in like like a special frozen account sort of. And now that Bitcoin, you're using a second layer, you're using a different accounting mechanism to say who owns it and who doesn't, right? And that could be like, so I tend to be like a layer two maxi, like in terms of super permissive, like very liberal, like layer two definitionalist, where I'm like, you and I could put Bitcoin into a two of two and then have a piece of paper napkin between us that says who owns what in that Bitcoin. And as long as like the both of us can decide that that napkin has the right number, like, it's fine. Like that's our layer two. We now have a second accounting system. It's cheap. It's offline. It's super private. The only way anyone can see how much money each of us has is by looking at that napkin, that sort of thing. So yeah, so that's kind of how I think about layer twos. And then like, there's a big question of like, well, is Coinbase layer two then? I'd be like, yeah, I think so. You give them your money. It's like the cheapest and easiest way to have a layer two is you find someone, you give them your Bitcoin, they now own it. They give you a little like almost IOU, or like in their database, they like write a little thing that says Nifty now owns like, I don't know, 100,000 sats. And that's like, that's the accounting mechanism. And that's super cheap. It's very centralized. It's very permissioned. If Coinbase loses my money or decides that they forgot my database entry, it's a whole mess. But like, like that, in terms of like just like layer two is an accounting mechanism, if you go like that simple of a definition, almost anything could look or be a layer two.
Right. So in this permissive Nifty universe, right, the definition of an L2 is literally effectively just taking Bitcoin off chain, doing accounting with it, and then having some sort of mechanism for settling back on chain. And that could be, literally as simple as somebody being like, here, I'm going to give you your Bitcoin back.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Right. And so then then there's the exit, right? And that's where exiting layer two comes in, is like, okay, well, how do I take my money out of that account, like from Coinbase, and move it back into the global ledger, where now I can use the global ledger to keep track of the fact that I own that Bitcoin now. And that's exiting a layer two.
This kind of comes to sort of like the core question. So, like, if the most permissive definition of a layer two is you're taking Bitcoin effectively off chain, doing off chain accounting with it, and then have some sort of mechanism for bringing back that settlement on chain, then how are people trying to improve upon this concept and sort of win the layer two wars? Like, what makes a good L2 versus a not
Oh,
so good L2? Right.
yeah,
And
these
what
are
are the,
right.
yeah. And there's a
Yeah,
few
right.
different ways that people are trying to make good L2s, right? But so maybe we could dive into some of those options a little, because we're seeing new ones in a post ordinals universe pop up
Yes,
and a
exactly. And I
post
think this.
BTM universe pop up, which I'm sure
Oh,
will.
right. But VM is a whole nother way, right? So I think my framework from 2 years ago kind of goes into some of this. So like maybe I'm pulling a couple things from there. I don't have a really good write up on it. I just have like some notes on a Google just thing. Maybe I should, whatever. But I think like okay, so one of them is like where when you take your Bitcoin from the layer one and you put it into something where now it's like okay, it's in the shared account, it's in some big mysterious UTXO on Bitcoin. What does that look like? Is it a private key that someone else owns? Is like that would be the Coinbase case. Is it a private key that belongs to a multi-sig where you own one of the multi-sig keys? Is it a multi-sig where you don't own one of the multi-sig keys, but a group of other people do? Maybe some shadowy supercoders, etc.
Or
Um,
institutions, or like,
or
fancy
institution.
custodial, whoever the
Someone who's wearing the fancy I am a totally official custodian hat.
yeah,
Like, yeah, there's
the
keys.
official custodial
The official
multi-sig.
custodian hat. Maybe there's some multi-sigs that have a certain amount of code written around them. So, like, Liquid is a good example. They've got like fancy HSMs. I do have my prop. Maybe I have my prop. They like basically like have hardware wallets kind of thing. Liquid is like fancy hardware wallets but it's still like other people holding those
Which is
keys.
basically code for computers hold the keys and do fancy math around the keys rather than just human beings holding the keys. Maybe
Exactly.
one step better from
Right, exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
And where are the computers located? Like they're distributed across the globe, like, hard to find, whatever. Yeah. So there's that. That's a thing. So now it's like, okay, like and Lightning I think was kind of Lightning is in the category of like it's a multi-sig. You hold one of the keys. So the money can't go anywhere unless you approve it. And we have a lot of fancy code written around it in your Lightning node that manages signing of things for you, managing those keys and signing for those keys, that kind of thing. Um, yeah, so that's right. So that's like the multi-sig thing. And then there's like all these new kind of fancier things. They're like, okay, well, the problem with keys, even if they have the best security around them, and even if they have like these like really well audited software projects that are running code to decide whether or not to sign for a thing, and it has like all the perfect information. At the end of the day, those keys still exist, right? So the idea is that, well, the not the idea, but the problem or like the issue with that is that at some point maybe someone somehow could might find enough private key material that they could independently sign for those funds and move them somewhere else, even though like the software wouldn't have allowed that. But private keys are just data, just a number somewhere in the world. And if someone manages to find enough of those numbers for that particular multi-sig, even if like you're holding the keys, right? There's this like fear that the underlying Bitcoin contract would allows anyone with that key that knows that secret to move those funds, right? So I think there's like this movement that's like, okay, what if we could make the Bitcoin script smarter somehow so that you don't have to know a key anymore. You have to have some amount of next state update that's valid. And whatever that means is like, then you start getting into like, okay, maybe there's bugs in the validity up like the code that you've written. And that's like a whole different thing. So now you have to worry about bugs in code rather than losing keys. But I think that's sort of like the new frontier is like, okay, we're going to put money into shared UTXOs where like a bunch of people is going to represent the funds of a bunch of people. But how do we then decide who has permission to move the money out and where are they allowed to move it? And who's making those decisions, who's approving it, like what makes valid state updates of where that money is allowed to move, and how can we maybe write more expressive Bitcoin contracts that kind of restrict or allow that based on logic and not keys. I don't know. Can't wait.
And this is sort of where we start to get into conversations about things like OpCat and Bitcoin improvement proposals, right? So like the challenge with the
And
entire
yeah.
L2 environment structurally right now is that you're always going to have the keys or have to exist somewhere problem, right? Like there's always going to be some kind of, for lack of a better word, bridge where
Yes.
the movement from Bitcoin on L1 to L2 is protected by keys that in theory could be hacked, even though it would be incredibly difficult in a lot of situations. In theory, they could. Like the trust is never going to be 100% trustless without some sort of like soft fork or ability to change Bitcoin's code such that we could accomplish what? So like what would OpCat do, for instance, or what would like a similar covenant style proposal do to fix this problem?
Yeah, so I think the idea with adding a covenant is that so like for Lightning right now, Lightning uses covenants, but we use multi-sig covenants, not in written into Bitcoin script covenants. So I think if you know Lightning, I think you're quite at a sort of an advantage in terms of understanding the usefulness of covenants for building these kinds of like layer two protocols because like we use them. And one of the things that we do, we basically like what it does is it's you like when there's funds in and output, basically how do I explain it easily? The general idea is we use it to kind of be like the only place that these funds can go is one of these two outputs, if that makes sense. But so we write out the contract basically in Lightning, you write out, okay, these funds must go one of these two places, you make a transaction, and then you get both parties to sign on that new transaction. And so like the only place it can go is where that transaction says, if that makes sense. So you get the two parties to sign off on a written document that says this is where the money must go with covenants, like, so if we had something that let us write, like, basically, if you had a way that in Bitcoin script you could said this money, this UTXO, can only be spent by a transaction that looks like this. And that looks like this part is pretty key. That's called introspection. That's what all these new opcode proposals like CTV, CAT, TX hash, so anything else that does really what they're trying to let you do is look at what the transaction that's spending your Bitcoin looks like. We call that fancy word is introspection. But basically we're like, okay, when you spend these funds, it can only spend into a transaction that has this particular characteristics. Like the money has to go to this output. Um, or it has to have this lock time or like these things, if that makes sense. So you no longer have to like get and actually write that transaction and get two people to sign it. Now you can write that into the Bitcoin contract itself, and so you don't have to actually get signatures in order to make that output. You can just make the output, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So
So it's
by
like less signatures, slightly
this
less
is
signatures.
this is actually a realization I'm having in real time. So by making covenants possible,
Yeah, and
you
making
are
introspection. Let's say making introspection possible,
right,
because that's really
right,
what you want. You want introspection.
right. Which basically means you can like functionally eliminate the risk that somebody who's not supposed to get the Bitcoin gets the Bitcoin because you have sort of predetermined in the code that the Bitcoin can only go to certain places.
Yes,
That is the key. That's the key thing that we want
that's
is
the
we
key.
want to make sure that this is like it makes like unhackable bridge situation basically, right?
Is
At the
yes,
script level, at like the
yes. But
smallest ultimate like most base layer level of what Bitcoin is.
this is my understanding. The trade-off here, though, is that you have to make the script right. And if you make a mistake in the script, you basically have burned funds. So it's like very similar to like, like it's trade-offs, right? On the one hand, if you make a mistake with the signatures, you just resign, everyone moves on with their life. It's fine. If you write it in the script and the script is wrong, well, that was fun. Thanks for playing.
So there's a handful of Bitcoin improvement proposals, BIPs, that could theoretically accomplish this, right? So proposed opcodes that could accomplish
Accomplish introspection. They're
that
trying to
accomplish
make it such
introspection.
that you can look at the next transaction. That's right.
Which makes it such that you could only spend that you could set up transactions that preemptively understand that they can only be sent to certain addresses, and that kind of makes them unhackable, sort of.
Yeah, but like I have questions about this, which like I still haven't. I think I had a tweet thread about this recently where I'm like, one of the things in so the way this is coming from my understanding of Lightning works. I think when you get down into it, it's like these other systems aren't going to work this way, they're going to work differently. But the way that Lightning works is that update the balance. So you're constantly changing like who gets what in a transaction, which means you constantly have to change it. But if you wrote that into the script and you sent the Bitcoin to it, that would mean you'd have to like spend the Bitcoin and update the script, which would get rid of the whole point of having a layer two, if that makes sense. So like this is where I'm like I start getting like really like I feel like there's something I'm missing here about how this introspection stuff is going to make these other layer twos work. Maybe it's like something about like the CTV stuff, or hopefully maybe we can find a guest who can better explain what I'm
We'll get
missing
Rindell
about
on
this.
here eventually. Rindell is a guest I would love to have on.
Yeah, but I don't like this is where like people say they want these introspection opcodes to help them scale Bitcoin. And I'm like, okay, but what does that look like? Like the guys that are doing like, okay, we want introspection opcodes because we want to be able to do zero knowledge proof things. It's like, well, you don't really just need introspection, you also need better math primitives. And this is where something like Rusty's great script restoration project makes a lot of sense because he's going to fix them. His proposal includes fixing the like ability to do math in Bitcoin script, if that makes sense. So it's like you want introspection, but I think you also want other things because just getting introspection, I don't think gets you as far along as you think it does in terms of actually building a robust layer two mechanism that lets you do the proof system or whatever that you need so that you can actually make sure that like the state transition that happened on the layer two is valid or whatever. And this is where we start getting into like, okay, zero knowledge proofs maybe are like a even better way of doing this because really what you want to prove, really what you want is you want like on that layer two system, you want well, layer twos are interesting, right? Because it's like one of the things is they're like, okay, well, global state on layer one is too expensive, right? It's too expensive to tell everyone that I sent sats to Isabel, right? Like that's just too expensive for anyone. Like you know, the
the
analogy I
data
like to
availability problem, right? I mean, essentially.
yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting around to is like layer ones on Bitcoin. The analogy I like to use is you're sitting in a stadium and I'm going to buy a beer from you and I'm going to give you money for the beer. But the way Bitcoin works is I have to let everyone in the stadium know that I gave you $5 for a beer. It's like that is the nature of you transacting on layer one, right? It's global. Like when a transaction happens, everyone finds out about it. Like my $5 went from my wallet to your wallet, and everyone needs to know that. It's like
Right.
everyone's business.
Right.
And that's expensive. Like
Yeah.
there's only so many people that can like we can only find out about so many people's transactions, like everyone, you know, like and
Well, and
that's
the
the
whole point of a
limitation.
layer two is to make it cheap, right? I mean, that's one of the
Right.
main functions of an L2, right? So, but you still
Okay.
end up coming up against the same problem, basically, is what you're saying, like at a certain
Kind
point.
of. It's in like, okay, so then we go to layer two, and it's like, okay, well, we still like we have a ledger now, and who needs to know about the data in the ledger, and who needs to verify that like me sending you money on the ledger two, like on that layer two is a valid transaction, right? And then it's like, well, what data do they need? Where do they get it from? Like, what ledger are we using to write it in now? Is it the Coinbase database? We can just go look at it. How auditable is it that I've sent you money on this system? And so then you kind of start getting interesting, like, I think this is where you start getting different ways of like, you know, these 90, 100, however many new layer twos, like one way you can start comparing them is like, okay, what data do they need in order to prove that I have sent you money on their layer? Who can verify that? How auditable is it? Yeah, one of the Bitcoin layer two protocols that's new is like Ecash Mints, right? There's a couple different ways that the bridges for those are built. Like Fedimint uses federations. Cashew is literally like a single custodian. It's the same as like handing Coinbase your money. The only difference is instead of using a Coinbase database, they give you like these little anonymous tokens that then in theory they don't know who they gave the tokens to, so you can like hide how much money you've given them in total if you do it
So is
over
that like a
time
that's like a
differently.
privacy layer
It's
more
a
than
privacy
anything?
thing, yeah. So it's a privacy thing, right? But then the other side of it is there's really like how do you audit how many of these tokens the mint has handed out compared to how much Bitcoin they've been given, like, and how do you audit that, like, so those sorts of things, like how do you audit that there's enough, like that data about who's given the mint money and how much money there is in the mint, like, is there an easy way to like suddenly verify that question mark?
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
like the
and there's
peg. It's the pegging problem, right? It's like the
no, so the pegging problem is the bridge problem, right? This is more the like, okay, like you've created a new ledger. Where does it live? How do you get the data? And then like, if there's a problem in the thing, like, who has the ability to inspect that and see if it's wrong, et cetera, like that kind of thing. I think.
right,
Um,
right.
yeah.
Well, and if you have a single custodian, there's always like some risk that like the funds that are inside this black box won't match the funds that are actually being owed, right? Which is,
Yeah.
that's sort of like the
FTX problem. No,
yeah. Or like, yeah, right. Okay,
bad
so
joke that I
just to
want to
kind of
start.
circle back,
Yeah,
we
go
like
ahead.
kind of touched on a lot of stuff right now. So to circle back, to circle back, so I mean, would you say, I mean, it sounds like you're saying that even if we had, OpCat or like a new op code, that wouldn't like immediately solve the problem. Like there's like other things that we should be
You need
considering
a
other than
protocol. Like you need like I guess this is the thing, and like you need like a layer two protocol. Like all these 90, 100 projects, right? Like you need like, and I think like I'm pretty sure like the Starkwork team like has figured out what their protocol is. I just like am not aware of what it looks like or how that works, if that makes sense. But like you need like a like I think introspection is a tool, but then you on using introspection, you can use introspection to like build a system, if that makes sense. And I think this is where like I really haven't spent as much time digging into like what the systems these people are proposing. Um, BitVM is one that we haven't really talked about, which like supposedly you can build bridges with BitVM without needing any forks. I think the idea is like BitVM is this general enough like thing that you could build any program you want. And what my understanding people have been building with it is like these zero knowledge proof solver systems, so you can like do fancy moon math, like zero knowledge proof stuff. And the reason that you want like, I think it's a good question of like why are the knowledge proofs and like blockchains? Like everyone seems to think that there's like some good synergy here, right? Zero knowledge proof tech's been around for a long time. Why are the like people doing blockchain stuff so into them? When you start to think, I think that what you get around to is like really when you're sending money, it's a state change, right? Like, well, state one was I had the money. State two is Isabel has the money. The state difference is the transaction that says I'm giving the money to Isabel, right? Um, Zero knowledge proof systems are all about proving that the correct state updates have happened without actually having to do the correct state updates, if that makes sense. So it's like basically a proof that like the money is now in your account, and I can prove that you having the money is a valid state of the system because I can prove that the steps it took to get to you were happened according to what should have happened, but I don't actually have to do the steps independently do all of the steps, if that makes sense. I can just give you this like this is where like to me this sort of starts becoming magic. I can just give you this magic thing that's like here's a proof, and you can like use the proof to be like okay, this says that given this program, and the program is like whatever I've like Bitcoin script, like Bitcoin, whatever rules about who's allowed to get the money. You can prove that the right thing has happened with this like proof without having to actually execute it. And so that means that the amount of like data and execution that anyone has to do in order to move money around gets quite lower. Anyways, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling a bit, but like my
well,
understanding is that this is like why people like zero knowledge proof things is you don't have to actually do the computation.
something else we chatted about a little bit yesterday was this idea of like we are spending all this time sort of like navel gazing about specific tech that should be built, should be this opcode, that opcode, versus like really, really being
Yeah.
thorough and exploring like what's the architecture, what are we trying to accomplish, what are we building, and why. I think something that's kind of related to that question that's sort of come up in a post-ordinals universe is like now we're starting to see a lot more of these L2s who are building for like DeFi and lending and all of these other use cases when like prior to that, most of the Bitcoin L2s were really focused on payment systems of some kind. Do you see that as like a big part of why, we're seeing all this new architecture?
Oh, 100%. I mean, okay, so as a Bitcoiner, one thing that when you get really into Bitcoin, as a dev, like all of the like hardcore Bitcoin OGs that I worked with on Lightning for a long time would talk about, shitcoins and altcoins and how there's always a new cycle of shitcoins being launched. To me, just historically, a lot of these new L2s look a lot like what we would have called shitcoins like a few cycles ago. And like, the original shitcoin
Shitcoins
cycles
are
were gonna,
coming to Bitcoin. Shitcoins have come
yeah,
to Bitcoin.
they have come to Bitcoin or
They
they're
have not.
trying to. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. But like they've
Pretty
arrived.
successfully, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like But
Yeah.
like, yeah, but what am I trying to say? Like, the original shitcoins were like, we're going to take Bitcoin Core, we're going to fork it. So it was like Litecoin came out, or like Zcash was like a Bitcoin fork with a few things changed. Like most of these, like most like altcoin season, like the first altcoin season was literally like, we're going to take the Bitcoin Core code, we're going to like change XYZ about it and rerun it and reship it, right? So it was like, okay, what if Bitcoin, but like changed in this slight way, right? And then we had, what happened after that? I mean, Ethereum was like, what if Bitcoin accepts like whatever world computer? I don't know.
Well, it was like a little bit different than just like a straight up fork. It was like a total reimagining of like what a blockchain does and what it's for, rather than just like some sort of like weird like copy pasta plus edits.
But
And then you
but
have the
like,
L1 explosion from Ethereum, right? I mean, then you have this
right,
whole obsession with like new L1. I don't see a ton of new L1s getting a lot of investment right now, even in altcoin shitcoin
exactly.
land.
Right.
Yeah,
So
that's
then
sort
we
of
had
over.
L1 seasons. So L1s are over. So L1s had their moment in the sun. Forks of Bitcoin had their moment in the sun. L1s, different L1s like had their moment in the sun. Where did we go after that? I'm trying to remember what was
Well,
like the
Ethereum
21 cycle.
L2s,
The
maybe.
Ethereum L2s, that was like a whole cycle. Right. So
Yeah.
then there was ERC20s, which were like assets on ETH took off, and
Mhm.
then people started doing NFTs on ETH. I think this happened right around the same time. And then there were like L2s, like what if L2, then it was really expensive because everyone was using it. So then like, okay, what about L2s on Ethereum? And I think that worked out really well for a couple parties. Like Base seems like they did really well. Arbitrum seems like they did extremely well. Um, I think there might be a couple other L2 projects over the ETH system. I apologize for not knowing their names,
There's
but
now L2s on Sol, I'm pretty sure. I know of at least one, if not two L2s on Sol, because Sol was having congestion problems and wasn't working. And you like legitimately like they were like needed to fix problems. Sol was like, not super
I mean,
reliable at
there's an
all times.
interesting, like, I think there's an interesting thing that goes here around, like, okay, like, everyone needs to know about the state. Like, a lot of these L2s are just like, what am I trying to say here? Like, they still have, like, I mean, I just saw a tweet. I need to go find it because to me it was a little bit historic, and that someone was complaining about gas prices on Base, which is the ETH L2 that Coinbase runs, right? It's an optimism fork, which uses optimistic fraud proof, like, stuff. But, like, it's very similar to Arbitrum. Anyways, but people are complaining about, like, transacting on this L2 has gotten expensive because there's too much volume. Like, it's like, okay, at that point, it's like, do these layers even scale? Like, what is scaling really? Like, like, anyways, what does that look like? Do we have like a metric of like scalability that we need to be like grading these projects against? Like, I don't know.
Okay, so that leads me to another question that I want to ask you as maybe a lightning maxi, a little, we're not sure
Maybe
yet,
lightning
but
round.
but clearly a lightning advocate of some kind and deep lightning expert. For those folks who don't know this yet, Nifty was a core lightning dev at Blockstream and now runs a super, super, super interesting Bitcoin education company where she talks about lightning quite a bit. I mean, I think one of the challenges this comes up with lightning. This was like a major selling point for a lot of these Bitcoin L2s is lightning doesn't scale. Like you're hearing a
Yeah.
lot of that lately, and it's going to be too expensive. And even, especially with Bitcoin native assets like ordinals and runes clogging up the system and like driving up block space fees. This is all kind of, I think, part of driving this Bitcoin L2 narrative is that lightning doesn't scale and we need something to replace lightning.
But
Thoughts?
okay, look, yeah. Lightning has it's not that Lightning doesn't scale. Lightning has a last mile problem. Is my like
A
my
what?
last mile problem. So
Oh.
it's originally this name of this last mile problem comes from laying like high speed internet cables to people's houses, right? And it was like it's too expensive, like running the backbones of high speed infrastructure like internet and for like fiber was good because you could get lots of traffic, and so like it was really expensive to put this like like these, it was really expensive to lay this fiber down, right? So like if you could put the fiber in places where thousands, millions of people are going to use it and each one of them pays you a few pennies, that over time will pay you back the amount of money it took to put the wire in place. But for people out in the boonies, like if you live like 20 miles to the next house, running fiber to your house isn't ever gonna pay back the investment because you're not sending enough like data packets, whatever, to justify that. So it has a last mile problem. I think one of the things is Lightning is still kind of looking for its like Starlink. Like, like how do we do Starlink for Bitcoin? Maybe that's my new like tagline. I don't know. And like when you look at how like Lightning actually works, it looks exactly like how big banks do banking with each other. Like Chase Bank has an account at, I don't know, let's say JP Morgan, and they like shuffle the money between these two they call them settlement accounts. It's like Lightning is basically recreating on an open standard settlement account technology using Bitcoin as a settlement layer. Like it works beautifully to that, it works perfectly. But setting these like relationships up is like a non-zero cost. And it's like, okay, the minimum amount of money that you need to have on Lightning and be using at like a regular basis, comparing it to like maybe opening a Visa checking like a Visa account at a bank, or like getting on the Visa network. It's basically adding a node on the Visa network. Right now you can only do that if you have millions of dollars and you're an actual bank, whereas like Lightning makes it like, okay, you need like thousands of dollars, and you can maybe be like a merchant or a vendor or someone who's doing like some amount of commerce above like maybe the Venmo use case. But when you start trying to build like the Venmo use case on Lightning, I think people suffer. And I think that's a lot of what we see. And I think when people say Lightning has failed, what they're saying is building Venmo for Lightning is like a thankless task that's really hard, and the end users don't understand the cost involved. And like I think like it's like, okay, this is a thousands of dollars banking technology. Like I have thousands of dollars that I want to like move around a month, or like I have known relationships with vendors that like I'm sending money to and from, like a lot, like that kind of thing. I think Lightning works and excels and does an amazing job at like those certain kinds of use cases and that kind of network, like money network relationships. But when you start getting to like, okay, like I want to build like a consumer app that's going to profit off of like, like thousands or millions of people doing transactions, et cetera. Like, I think Lightning's expensive, and I don't think I think we're still looking for the Starlink for Bitcoin in that way. And that's where things like, I think like Cashew or like Sentiment in particular become interesting, or even like Liquid, right? Breeze just launched this SDK that lets you build accounts where people hold their money on Liquid. And then when they want to send and receive it, they send and receive it over Lightning. So it looks and acts just like a Lightning app, except you don't ever have to open and manage Lightning channels. And the gateways that are managing the Lightning liquidity can be like almost more like a bigger, they're bigger financial entities sending bigger amounts of transactions between them, and they can manage the liquidity in that. And it's worth it for them, because they have thousands or millions of payments flowing through these like fat fiber wires of Bitcoin payments, if that makes sense. So, anyways, sorry, I feel like I'm
No, this
went
is
on.
awesome. So when you say, Lightning needs its Starlink, are you basically saying there that Lightning needs effectively like a complement or a supplement to get it through this last mile problem? Or are you imagining one of these technologies? You're not imagining one of these technologies will replace Lightning. You think that these technologies will work in tandem.
I think so, yeah. I really like I'm a big believer that Lightning is the connective tissue of the Bitcoin ecosystem, and that paying a Lightning invoice will be how you send Bitcoin, period. Like I think that is like, at least this is my hope. Like I hope everyone like standards around like Lightning invoices, because that's like, Matt, you just like go to a website, you pay in Lightning, all of your wallets speak Lightning. It's just like how you send and receive Bitcoin. But behind it is something like how you're actually like how most people are actually holding their sats. Like I think like Aqua Wallet is maybe a good example. Like you hold your sats in like the Liquid sidechain or something, and then when you want to like send and receive it, you swap it in and out of Lightning because it's
Are
cheap, that kind of
are
thing.
you therefore saying, I mean, do you think that this will, I imagine you're suggesting that this will mostly be happening with some level of custody then, right? I mean, Fedi is like
Yeah.
somewhat custodial, and like this, if we're talking about like big Lightning liquidity providers being like the backbone of the system, then what we're talking about is custodial Lightning. You would say that that's the likelihood.
I would say that, yeah,
Yeah.
like yeah. Well, it's just expensive.
Yeah.
Like sovereignty is expensive, decentralization is expensive. Like, and I feel like it's like one of the things is like it's like I think the thing about being able to like be a node on like the Visa superhighway for Bitcoin is like I think it is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars though. I don't think it's like I'm making $5 payments, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that's my
And
hot take is that custodial for like your checking account isn't that big of a deal, especially if your savings account is all like, on like a hardware wallet on layer one.
I think there's like a missing piece in the wallet ecosystem that kind of unites all these things in like a nice interface, right? Where you can see all your like checking, savings account, that kind of thing. I think we'll get there, just not today. And like people are still trying to figure out like what is that layer two that is cheap to transact on, like what is the Starlink of Bitcoin. Like it'd be kind of funny if this episode comes out and all of a sudden you have all these like, you know, 10 new projects pop up that are like, we're the Starlink for Bitcoin now.
If you had to pick a technology, so these are like the hardcore payments technologies, right? Like Fedi, Lightning. These are like Maxi technologies. Maxi's like payments. If you
That's true.
had to
Yeah,
pick
Max is like
one,
payments.
Maxis love payments. They don't like
That's what we're
lending,
here for,
but they like.
Isabel. We're here to hodl and we're here to do payments. Like, I don't know what else there is. Like, what else is there? Like,
Well. So let's just put this out there. So I think some of the, as we kind of chatted about before, some of the appeal of these other L2s is that they're making other use cases possible. Things like some of which are just like complete, just degenerate, like gambling, and some of which are maybe somewhere, you know, more legitimate. I mentioned lending yesterday.
it's finance, though. I feel like it's like, okay, but
Right.
that's like the financialization, and that's where like, you know, this is what destroys
That's
this. This is what destroys states, Isabel. Like, this is where like, you know, it's like hard money, no loans. Like, I
But
mean,
but lending has existed since the beginning of time. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, you're not going to eliminate it. Like, financial
Isabel, can
services
I
are
borrow
going to
$5? No, I'm kidding.
exist. No, it's going to happen. It's going to have people are always going to be willing to take on some level of risk in exchange for yield. Like, that's going to happen in a hyper Bitcoinized world too.
But I
And
think this
so,
is where people, that's true. And I think this is where people are like, yeah, but with Lightning, you can like hold your Bitcoin and earn fees for like, I don't
ish,
know, like it's like
ish,
ish.
yield ish. We'll see about that. Yeah. And the people who will be earning the yield, though, will be these big institutional liquidity providers, right? It's not going to be average Joe. Anyone participating in custodial Lightning is not going to get that yield unless there
Because
was some.
the
Probably
network is
not. I mean,
the
maybe there would be like, it would
yeah.
be kind of interesting to see if there could be like pass back yield yeah. But again, it's so small ish. We'll
I
just
mean,
leave it at ish.
but it
But
goes back. I mean, I do think you get back to that whole thing of like these layer twos are going to be competing for Bitcoin to get locked into them, right? And
yeah.
so I think that's where like where does the yield come from? It's like, well, like the competition, maybe VC friends. I don't know, like um
Or like these like applications that will be built on top that will have risk, right? Like lending applications and things like that. The DeFi applications that have made their name in shitcoinery, right? Or in other
finance. We're gonna finance. I'm looking for a
right.
Bitcoin in finance. I'm looking for a layer two in finance. Something I don't know, like something
I'm
like that,
looking
right?
for a
Like,
layer two in finance. Yeah, exactly. 6'2", blue eyes. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And a lot of people want this.
Cheap
I
fees. No,
I would love like a really, really good like trustless lending like situation. I mean, as a person who is like, you know, I've on many occasions asked myself, like, ooh, how could I, you know, like take out some money against my Bitcoin without having to sell my Bitcoin? I mean, that's a real problem. Anyway, long
these are
story
wealthy
short,
people problems. This is
it's a
like
wealthy
they're like I
wealthy
don't. But
people.
you know, like oh, okay, look, we just
Those
need to like
wealthy people
defund
have
the
problems too.
state so that like defund the state so that there's no tax implications of selling your Bitcoin anyway. No, and
Yeah.
also
No,
fix the
no,
number
no,
go up
exactly.
technology thing so that the Bitcoin price isn't going up forever and selling it and getting it back at the same price is no longer the gamble that you're playing. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah. And you can obviously, I mean, I think that the environment for Bitcoin lending, because Bitcoin lending already exists, you pay super high interest rates and, you know, it's all done through
Yes,
like
it's oh my God,
institutional.
oh my God, the interest rates are so high. I've looked at it
It's
once and
crazy. No, it's
I was like,
wild.
how much are people paying? All right. Like,
Yeah,
all
you're
right.
talking about like a minimum of like 13-14% interest to like borrow against your Bitcoin, like super like over collateralize the whole thing. Like it's
That
really
just
wild.
seems ripe for disruption because
Yeah, exactly.
Bitcoin seems like it would have like
Well, part of it is that institutions hate Bitcoin, right? Like part of it is just that institutions don't want to take Bitcoin as collateral because they see it as super, super risky and volatile and all of the things. And I think when
that's gonna
price
be
stabilizes, things will change. I do think those interest rates will go down as Bitcoin
I
is.
don't think yeah, I don't think the brights yeah, interesting. I don't know. I'm like
You're like, it's going to stay that way.
no, I think new players are going to enter the market who just
Right.
value Bitcoin for Bitcoin, and that's going
Right.
to be like it's
Yeah.
like they're not even gonna like Bitcoin is going to have this intrinsic value to a new player in the system.
But if
Like
you
that
could
makes
do
sense.
lending without like if there were like, you know, the safe
Mm,
basically like the safer ways to do lending, theoretically the better, less custodial risk is better, blah blah blah. In terms of these
true.
other L2s that are coming online that are trying to solve these like degen problems, finance problems, let's call it that. do you see any of those technology? I mean, are there any of those technologies that you would say are kind of more interesting than others, or like more kind of technically appealing than others for any other reason, for any reasons?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know enough about the current proposals to really have a good idea about like which particular one I think is going to be better at like taking a loan against your Bitcoin. I think in terms of use cases, that taking a loan out against your Bitcoin is probably going to be number one, right?
That's what I think. That's the one that I think is most important of the three.
Oh, yeah, which is
Yeah.
kind of funny because it's like I feel like it's funny because like when you hear about all these layer twos and stuff, a lot of what people talk about with it is like, oh, it's about like I don't know, AMMs or like trading or something. And it's like people that hold Bitcoin, I feel like are maybe, I mean, maybe they're total, maybe that is like totally a thing. And like people are definitely gonna like invest in that, etc. And we're gonna rebuild all the MEV boxes that we can, and like because those are where you can extract value and there's like money in that. I don't know.
That's the thing, is that there's money in it because there's high volume, right? Like trading by definition, you have tons of executions of transactions happening all the time. And like theoretically, whoever's building these technologies can take fees, right? So it like makes sense that people want to build stuff for degens because they're like, they're using these protocols constantly. I think something that's interesting though that you also pointed out yesterday that I really appreciated was like by definition though those use cases like venture capitalists and investors are going to want to invest in more centralized technologies so that they can take these fees, right? Like if the business model is getting fees, generating fees on transactions for one reason or another, that's going to influence where investment in these technologies goes.
Yeah, you want to be capturing the marketplace. Like VC money at the end of the day wants to go where it's going to collect more money, right? And that tends to be places where there's like a lot of exchange happening or a lot of like people, right? And those are like centralized, those are all centralized projects for the most part.
Do you think we have like a fundamental technical problem with like open source software, decentralized technologies kind of inherently being less interesting to investors
To
across the
capital?
board? Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, 100%. I think that's always been the case because like the thing about open source is it's built to be infrastructure because it's useful and it's a tool and it's given away almost for free, right? And like that's like almost the opposite of how capital acquisition and value extraction works, right? Now I feel like I'm talking
Like
like using
charity.
yeah, and like I feel like I'm almost using more like capital extraction or value like value skimming. It feels very like Marxist in a way, but like, you know, I feel like it's like
But how do you solve for that problem, right? I mean, is that just like a structural? I mean, now this is like a philosophical question, right? Like, how do you solve the
yeah.
problem of, wanting to live in a world where information and data and like, technology is open source and free to everyone, and also like be dependent on investors who need to make money?
This is like, you know, this is where I think like this whole loan thing is a problem. Like it's like maybe you shouldn't have like I don't know. One of my favorite economists is this woman named Jane Jacobs. She's written a bunch of really great books, and one of the things that she cautions against is something that she calls cataclysmic capital. That like in ecosystems and economies, like you run into trouble and like weird things happen when you get like vast amounts of money pouring into space to try and achieve some sort of like goal that's basically restructuring the system, et cetera. And I think sometimes that's kind of what VC money is trying to do. It's like trying to reimagine and reshape the system in such a way that it can like basically recreate a monopoly.
Well, especially in crypto, that feels like what every VC is trying to go after,
Yeah.
if not just like get the shitcoin liquidity. I mean, that's obviously another goal of theirs. But like in the broader
Yeah.
scheme, I feel like that's what every investor in blockchain technologies is trying to do, is trying to be like get the killer whale, change the system technology.
Change the system in such a way such that all the transactions flow through some sort of thing where we can capture value out of it, either through like rent fees to like transact through our system or through whatever, right? And this is where I feel like, you know, kind of gets back into like, okay, like decentralization is good because it keeps the market competitive, which means it keeps the like serve goods and services serving the people for like this is what, as a user, like incentive wise, like you get the best service in highly competitive markets, right? And so how do you keep things highly competitive? Well, like you kind of need to keep them decentralized, right? And so this is kind of where like decentralization is like I don't know, an axiom of freedom. I would put this in, like I don't know if this is officially part of any like anarchist or like cypherpunk manifesto, but like decentralization is expensive. Being your own bank is like non-trivial. It's expensive in time to learn how to do it. It's expensive in time to like maintain and keep the systems running. It's expensive like in terms of like, yeah, it's the setup costs, the maintenance, the running it, the education, the knowing what you're doing, the confidence that you have to run it. Like that's expensive.
Energy, responsibility, reliability. I mean, this is why custodial solutions will continue to exist, is because people don't want to put the effort. I mean, with self-custody comes quite a bit of responsibility that I think people underestimate.
Sovereignty is expensive.
Sovereignty is expensive. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like maybe sovereignty is a luxury, is like, I don't know.
Unfortunately, it might be.
I don't know. Anyways, I feel like it's
interesting.
Yeah. Get into like things where I get in trouble. I don't know.
I know.
Not that
Michael Saylor just got like almost canceled for saying shit like this. We've got to be careful.
Yeah, but I think this is where it's like I think that when we think about luxury, maybe luxury doesn't have to be unattainable. Maybe we can live in like the luxury, whatever they call it, gay communist luxury, whatever, capitalism, like anarchist future. But that takes but we have to work in that direction, if that makes sense. And like, I mean, obviously I started a Bitcoin education company because I like strongly believe that like if we're going to exist in a consensus oriented environment, which is what Bitcoin purports to be, it means that in order to have consensus, you need the people that are having the conversations to understand what they're even agreeing to or what they're trying to come to consensus about. And that takes like, I know this is such, I feel like I'm
like the democracy problem.
I know. I feel like we're like rehashing what is democracy. And it's like, oh, like people need to understand like part of decentralization is like this huge communication and education piece, which is expensive. Like communication is expensive.
And it's never ending, right? I mean, like there's always
you get a new piece of information, you have to retell everyone. Well, it's like, wait, and then it's like, okay, new people come online, they need to be brought up at the same point. We're always going to be having new people coming online because hopefully people continue having children, right? Like, so like hopefully there's always new Bitcoiners or like people being born into the system that have to learn all this stuff, right? And family probably isn't going to whatever. So you have to learn all this stuff. Like there's a lot of stuff to learn about how to be self-sovereign, etc., and like how to run a server, how do computers work. Like there should be general information that I feel like is accessible to a lot of people, and it's just I would say not very accessible. And then it's like even at the Bitcoin layer, like ignoring all that, it's like okay. How does Bitcoin work? What are we even proposing when we say covenants? Like no one talks about introspection. They talk about covenants, but covenants doesn't mean anything. What you want is you want introspection. No one's talking about what is introspection. How does it work? What are the options? Like why is OpCat so fucking expensive? No one's talking about the fact that OpCat's expensive because no one really understands how expensive OpCat is. No one understands that like the way that OpCat does introspection. Is like a complete like break from historically what we've done in terms of protocol design for Bitcoin upgrades on layer one, in terms of like data, like how much data does it require to like do XYZ thing. Anyways, but like you need people out there being like explaining how that works, and that is expensive. Like that is.
I feel like we could do like an entire deep dive episode on like covenants / like the different options for how you create introspection. But actually, I feel like this is like a good opportunity for us to maybe talk a little bit about BTC++ and like how you're trying to solve this educational problem. I feel like that's like
yeah. So it's kind of like there's two ways I've been trying to solve education. One is by trying to actually create content and classes and a framework and a structure. And it's like, okay, here's like the class pathway of XYZ. Like here's the things you need to know about Bitcoin from a technical perspective, right? I feel like I got distracted then because I started a conference series where I'm like, okay, how do we bring all the people who know how these things work together to explain, and we can record it, do recordings of it, and put out videos and like build knowledge within the developer ecosystem of Bitcoin. What is going on? What are these new things? What do they mean? What do they enable? Who's doing it? Like, come hang out. We'll have a good time. We'll hack together. We'll like have some barbecue if you come to the Austin event. Actually, I think we do steak at almost everything. Just
Yeah, well, that's just the Bitcoin way. You have to have stake at your event, or you're just, you just don't understand the culture.
Or is it a Texan thing? I don't know. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, I mean the baby, but that's also something I feel like I remember like when ordinals happened, I remember thinking it was like, Bitcoin's more than just like beef maxis, but I'm
We
kind of
do
a
have
beef
some
maxi
vegans in
myself.
our midst. They're like they always complain because I'm like I never ask if they want not meat options. I get in trouble. I think in the past I've gotten in trouble for as a conference organizer trying to anyways, it's fine.
That's a whole other episode, is like the
That's a whole other
cultural
thing.
implications of all of this. I mean, like, I'm convinced that so much of what's going on right now with all these Bitcoin L2s is literally just like, it is mostly like Ethereum and Solana people, is my understanding, who are coming in and building the majority of these new L2s.
Well,
And
yeah, because they
yeah,
have experience with it more so than a lot of Bitcoiners who are like lightning,
yeah,
lightning sucks, lightning, whatever,
yeah.
lightning, lightning, lightning.
They
But
know what the degens want. Yeah, they are the
they
degens.
know what they know what they know their audience more
They
so
know
than
their
like
market.
the
Exactly.
rest
They're
of
building
these.
products for their market. Oh my
And it's cool
gosh.
that they're
Well,
doing it on Bitcoin. Maybe, I don't know,
and they need to
maybe.
go to BTC plus plus and like get boned up. I actually think the biggest challenge, I have
Yeah.
no problem with Ethereum and Solana degens coming and building on Bitcoin. I actually think that's great. Like everyone should be building on Bitcoin. But they are, my understanding, or at least in like the first year after ordinals, the biggest challenge for them was that their developers had no idea how Bitcoin works. They'd never worked with a UTXO set before. They were totally, kind of underqualified to actually be building on Bitcoin. So yeah, if you're listening to this and you are like in the Bitcoin season 2 ecosystem and like, come, potentially in the developer world, wanting to improve your Bitcoin dev skills, go to BTC plus plus. Work with
Yeah. We're doing
Nifty.
one in Brazil in February. Is a good time to plug it. We are going to be in the beautiful beach town of Florianopolis at the height of summer, right before Carnival, and it's all about leveling up and hacking. It's mostly focused on workshops, trying to figure out what my strategy for like doing base 58 kind of like education at it is. So like it's all going to be about working, showing off what your skills are, stretching yourself, and making some new friends and working on stuff too. So
Hell yeah. I'm super excited. Brazil. Oh, it's going to be so good. Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. This was awesome. I hope you'll be a regular guest on the pod. And yeah, anything else? Do you want to show any last minute BTC plus plus links? We'll put stuff obviously in like the posts and tweets, etc. But if there's anything else you want to share about BTC plus plus before we go? No?
I think that's everything. Thanks, Isabel.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Nifty. Bye.